sincere thanks to the BBVA Foundation, to the Distinguished Selection Committee, to Professor Richard Kerridge for those lovely remarks. It's a real honour, it's a real humbling experience, and a somewhat embarrassing experience also to have a video about yourself. But thank you. It's an honour. It's also a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you all tonight and to share some of my work with you. I've always used the word honour too much already, but it is an honour to have received this award. The humanities and social sciences have such crucial roles to play in understanding and responding to our current environmental crisis, and I want to sincerely thank the BBVA Foundation for their insight in the creation of this award. I think too often we assume that the environmental challenges that we face are primarily or even solely the responsibility of the natural sciences to deal with, and the creation of this award has meant a tremendous amount to the environmental humanities community around the world. So thank you to the Foundation. So the talk that I've prepared for this evening draws on nearly 2 decades of research and writing about extinction, from the very first fieldwork that I did after my PhD right up to the present. I was originally trained as a philosopher, but I was always inspired by the empirically grounded work that my colleagues in anthropology and history and other disciplines were doing. So during my PhD, I began to do interviews and carry out short field visits, and to find ways to work with these materials in my more philosophical thinking. In the decades since, fieldwork has become ever more central to my work, and in company with a growing group of scholars, I now think of my research as a kind of field philosophy. Doing philosophy in the field transforms the discipline in a range of important ways. To begin with, it reshapes the literatures and the sources of information that we draw on, as well as the kinds of questions that we ask. In my case, it's meant an approach to extinction that's thoroughly grounded in empirical research with both scientists and local communities, seeking to better understand how extinction shapes the contours of lives and landscapes. As a result, my work focuses on the effort to think through particular extinction events, to ask what this extinction means, why it matters, and subsequently to ask what kinds of responses it might demand of us. But doing philosophy in the field also crucially reshapes our modes of communication. Working with communities requires us to find ways both to share our insights broadly, as well as to take on the role of creatively making spaces for other people, a diverse range of people, to share their own stories and insights. So grounded in this approach to extinction, the lecture I'd like to share with you is a selection of stories from the field. As I hope to demonstrate, storytelling is a serious business. As the feminist science studies scholar Donna Haraway has put it, in our current time we are quite literally storytelling for earthly survival. That is, seeking to imagine and to chart a course towards other ways of understanding ourselves and our world. I hope that these stories and the lessons and ideas that can be distilled from them might offer some useful guidance in this effort. So, thickening our sense of what extinction means and why it matters. So the first critically endangered Hawaiian tree snails that I encountered in the forest were a group of 7 Acatinella mustelina resting in the midday heat. As I stood and watched this cluster of snails, I found myself more and more curious about their largely unseen routines. Did they usually gather together in this way during the day? When they moved around at night, how far did they go? If they made their way back to this spot each morning, how and why did they do so? What kinds of understandings, social relationships, and evolutionary imperatives grounded this pull to aggregate in a clump, to spend the day resting alongside other snails? In short, I realised that I knew very little about snails. In exploring these questions with biologists, I quickly discovered that the first thing to note is that snails rely, of course, on very different modes of sense perception from those that dominate most human lives. To begin with, snails are pretty much blind. Alongside their all but absent vision, snails are also thought to be largely deaf. In place of these senses, snails' worlds take shape primarily through chemoreception. The closest approximation with the human sensory repertoire is our own senses of smell and taste, both of which pick up chemical signals in the environment. But for a snail, these chemosensory faculties are much more finely tuned. It's here that the tentacles on a snail's head, packed with sensory neurons, come into their own. For most terrestrial snails, there is a division of labour, with the two superior tentacles positioned higher on the head and larger in size, focused on long-range sensing, and the two inferior tentacles being primarily used to smell or taste things directly in front of the snail. The world is saturated with chemical cues for those with the capacity to taste them. Snails pick up, as Richard described so much more beautifully than I will, a range of chemicals. Their own and others' slimy secretions, their mucus trails, are particularly important though, with experiments showing that these mucus trails contain all sorts of information about the individuals that laid them down, their species, their health, their reproductive status, and much more. So one of the key ways in which I've sought to develop our understanding of what is lost in extinction is to thicken our sense of who these disappearing creatures are, to add some flesh to the bones of the dead and dying. In the first instance, this requires knowing more about these species, understanding a little of their particular and unique ways of life. That is, how they hunt or reproduce, how they take care of their young, or perhaps grieve for their dead, or indeed how they perceive, navigate, and make themselves at home in a forest. Of course, we can never hope to sketch anything like a complete picture of the ways of life of other species. Much of who they are and how they are in the world must remain opaque to us, beyond our current or even our possible comprehension. The chemosensory, slime-mediated worlds that snails inhabit are but one of the countless number of experiential worlds that together comprise our living planet. And yet, despite these epistemic limitations, the effort to learn more about others matters, perhaps now more than ever, as so many of these distinctive ways of life are slipping out of existence. To appreciate this situation is to be brought into an encounter with an important layer of the tragedy of extinction. What is lost with each species is not simply a set of genetic resources, but rather an entire world. As the philosopher Vincent Desprez has noted, every sensation of every being of the world is a mode through which the world lives and feels itself. And when a being is no more, the world narrows all of a sudden, and a part of reality collapses. Attending to the ways of life and experiential worlds of other beings in this way helps to thicken our sense of what is lost in extinction. But importantly, it also reminds us that these ways of being are not crafted in isolation. They are unavoidably ways of being that come into and out of the world in relationships with diverse others. This is a lesson that I learned from thinking with vultures, and so it is to their feathery forms that I'd like to now turn. There wasn't a vulture in sight. The sky above me was crowded with other birds, mostly crows, but also the larger bodies of black kites circling in the midday sun. As I stood and watched the birds, the bustle of the city of Mumbai continued around me. The cars, trucks and motorbikes loaded up with people and goods rushed past on the busy road. I'd heard that this place attracted carrion birds in large numbers, especially kites and crows. It had once also attracted their much larger avian counterparts and partners in scavenging, the vultures. But vultures could no longer be seen here. They were not circling in the sky above, nor did they line the high stone walls behind me where I knew they had once sat, heavy with food, waiting for their meals to digest before they could take to the air again. I was standing outside the Pasi Dungawadi, a walled compound in the heart of Mumbai, one of India's largest and fastest growing cities. I'd come to this place to talk to members of the Pasi community about the rapid decline of India's vultures and the impact that it was having on their funerary traditions. For thousands of years, the Parsis and their Zoroastrian ancestors in Persia placed the bodies of their dead inside stone towers to be exposed to the purifying rays of the sun and the beaks of vultures. As these birds have disappeared, that practice has become all but impossible. I stood there and watched the people and the birds around me until my taxi arrived and I climbed in, on the way to the house of a local Zoroastrian priest. Later, as I sat in the priest's home, I spoke with a Parsi woman who'd very generously agreed to guide me around town. We spoke about a comment that she had made several nights earlier when I had asked if she could remember when the vultures had begun to disappear from Mumbai. She had recalled that when her grandmothers had died in the 1970s and 80s, many vultures had been seen at the towers. But when my father died, she continued, which was in the late 90s, 1997, at that time we realised that there were no vultures, only small birds of prey like the kites and, of course, the crows. This comment, this way of gauging vulture presence, of course makes perfect sense for a member of a community whose primary relationship with these birds is through the exposure of the dead. But I was nonetheless struck by the close entanglement of my guide's memory of vultures with those very specific punctuations of her own personal life in which family members had died. This was a radically different way of understanding or living with vultures to any that I had personal experience of. This encounter took place almost 2 decades ago now, right at the start of my research on extinction, and it's shaped my thinking ever since. It undermined for me the common sense definition of extinction that tells us that it's a singular event that can be pinpointed precisely in time and space, something that takes place at the moment of the death of the last individual of a kind. In many ways, this understanding is, I think, misleading and unhelpful. The vultures remind us that extinction is actually a long and drawn-out process of unravelling that begins well before the deaths of the last individual and continues to ripple out into the world long afterwards as a host of different relationships change and break down. This process of unravelling is what I've referred to as the dull edge of extinction. As we pay attention to these rippling impacts, we see that there is no singular extinction phenomenon. Each species lost is its own unique happening. We might think, for example, about the plants that suffer as their pollinators decline, or about how the livelihoods and traditional cultural practices of some human communities are impacted as a relevant species becomes rarer and rarer. Just as each species is uniquely positioned in the world, uniquely bound up in relationships with others, the loss of each species produces its own unique disturbance patterns. Importantly, this is a process of biocultural unravelling, one that cuts across what we might think of as nature and culture, impacting on diverse humans and non-humans in a range of different ways. Taken together, these brief forays into the vulture-mediated funerary traditions of the Parsi community and the chemosensory worlds of snails provide a sense of the kind of thickening of extinction narratives that I think is needed in our present time. They remind us that each species is a unique way of being, a world of perception and experience, but importantly that each of these ways of being in the world is caught up in relationship. And so each extinction is inevitably a process of unravelling that remakes lives and landscapes. Part 2, doing ethics in the field. In December of 2001, a group of young whooping cranes took flight, migrating from Wisconsin to Florida. They were the first birds of their species to migrate in eastern North America in over a century. Equally as importantly, however, is the fact that they undertook this mammoth journey not on their own, but following behind an ultralight aircraft. Once present in populations across North America, by the early 20th century, the species was reduced to fewer than 20 birds. As a result of a range of factors, most importantly hunting and wetland loss, a single tiny population of whooping cranes was all that remained. In the late 1960s, the species was listed as endangered under US federal legislation, and a captive breeding program was begun. But for migratory birds like whooping cranes, there's an added complication. Cranes raised in captivity will not migrate, not having been taught by their parents that they should, or when or how to. To rectify this problem, ultralight aircraft were combined with an elaborate training program to establish the eastern migratory population. So this larger tale of whooping crane conservation has been told many times, and in lots of ways it's an incredible success story. But what's often left out of accounts of this work are all of the complex and compromised practices behind the scenes that enabled this success. In order for the species to survive in this way, many birds have been required to live their entire lives in strange and diminished captive environments and be exposed to ongoing stresses, including those of artificial insemination. Beyond the whooping cranes themselves, a number of other species have been drawn into the project, including less threatened sandhill cranes who have served as surrogates, helping to incubate whooping crane eggs, but also being used, and in some cases injured and killed, in the development of the techniques needed to teach young birds to follow an ultralight aircraft on a long migration. Various caring practices come together here, sometimes in alignment and other times in conflict. Intimate care for some feathered bodies, some species, sits alongside the domination, coercion, and abandonment of others. So my approach to the ethics of extinction has emerged through an effort to think through cases like this one. There are no simple answers here. On the one hand, I'm convinced that we have an ethical obligation not to unnecessarily cause the extinction of a species. But on the other hand, we ought to avoid harming and killing living beings wherever possible. Writing about whooping cranes, I described what I referred to as a regime of violent care. This was not so much a critique of this particular conservation project as it was an effort to grapple with the genuine difficulty of navigating a space of conflicting ethical obligations. Indeed, in this time of extinctions, it seems that efforts to care for disappearing species are very frequently saturated with, even grounded in, unavoidable and ongoing practices of violence towards others. My analysis of the whooping crane situation centred on a detailed discussion of the ways of life of these birds. I was particularly fascinated by the phenomenon of imprinting, most famously associated with the work of the Austrian ethologist Konrad Lorenz. Imprinting is a developmental process whereby many young animals form a strong attachment to the first moving object that they experience, which is, all things going to plan, I guess, usually a parent. And then they closely follow that individual. Of course, in situations in which animals are reared by humans in captivity or by members of a surrogate species, this often produces individuals that seem not to really understand themselves as members of their own species, and thus not to seek out mates with whom they have a chance of successfully reproducing. But alongside the challenges that it raises for conservationists, imprinting also presents important opportunities. Put simply, this kind of assisted migration with an ultralight aircraft is only possible because young birds can be raised in such a way that they will recognise a human dressed up in a strange crane costume, piloting an ultralight aircraft as some sort of surrogate parent and follow them around. So in my analysis, I argued that understanding imprinting, but also the broader developmental, ecological and social dimensions of whooping crane life is vital to making sense of how these birds might be being harmed in this process, as well as to working to minimise or prevent those harms. This points back to my earlier discussion a moment ago about the need to take seriously the ways of life of other species. Here we see that doing so is not just about taking stock of what is being lost in extinction, it's also a vital part of developing effective, ethical modes of conservation. Importantly, however, though, I resist the temptation to look to the behavioural sciences for an ultimate foundation for our ethics. The vast majority of the work in animal ethics is grounded in the effort to establish that at least some animals are morally relevant creatures. That is, that they demand our ethical consideration. And this is almost always done on the basis of some capacity that they have, such as being able to suffer and experience pain, or being the subject of a life. In company with a growing group of ecofeminist philosophers, science studies scholars, and multi-species theorists, my work is instead grounded in a rejection of these kinds of extensionist approaches. As the philosopher Val Plumwood noted, when it comes to animal ethics, these approaches tend to be based on sameness to the human, and as such they treat other species as of value just to the extent that they resemble the human as hegemonic centre, rather than treating others as an independent centre with potential needs, excellences, and claims to flourish of their own. So instead of working to define and delimit who does and does not count morally, my work begins from what the philosopher Thomas Birch has called a stance of universal consideration, in which other beings need not justify their existence or their value. This is not to say that whether or not animals suffer or live in the world as experiencing beings is morally irrelevant. Far from it. These kinds of insights help us to understand what particular animals need to lead flourishing lives. The point instead is that no such criteria can be or should be used to exclude some beings from our moral consideration. Instead, we're left with a much more difficult job, I think, of taking seriously the flourishing of all of the beings that we share this planet with. So I'd like you to hold on to that idea for a moment while I weave in another brief story from another part of the world. So in June of 2016, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to travel to the island of Rota in the Mariana Islands to learn more about a remarkable bird called the Mariana crow, or aga in the language of the local Chamorro people. Originally found on both the islands of Guam and Rota, the species is today completely extinct on Guam and just clinging to existence on Rota. The aga was listed as endangered in 1984, and a conservation program began. Importantly, the Mariana Islands have a complicated political status. Following a long history of occupation and colonisation by foreign powers, including Spain, after the Second World War, most of the islands in the chain became a semi-autonomous Commonwealth of the United States of America. As a result of this strange position, the effort to conserve the aga has centrally involved both local government managers and staff from the federal US Fish and Wildlife Service, drawing on the expertise of the San Diego Zoo. So the precise cause of the aga's decline on Rota is a bit of a puzzle. Conservationists generally point to a few likely causes, including predation by domestic cats, habitat loss, and perhaps the impacts of an unknown disease. But alongside these interwoven factors, it seems that deliberate disturbance and persecution of crows by local people has played an important role in their decline. The causes of this animosity are complex, but can be summarised very succinctly. Land. When I asked Thomas Mendiola about the situation, he told me that local people don't want aga crows on their land. Thomas is a deeply knowledgeable Chamorro man who lives and farms on Rota and has his own weekly radio show on Chamorro language and culture. He explained to me that historically Chamorro people have not been particularly interested in the aga. But when the efforts of Commonwealth and US federal agencies to conserve the birds began to interfere with their activities, in particular limiting land clearing and development, things began to change, pitting the aga against the people. In Thomas's words, so there's this dilemma. It's created by the presence of the crow, or by my wanting to be there. Whichever one. The point is, which is it going to be, me or the crow? Now, the law that puts one against the other like that is a total confusion. If there's any danger to the crow, or injustice, I would say, it is this law. Aga have been shot, they've been harassed and driven off land, they've had their food and nesting trees cut down, ring-barked or poisoned. Put simply, these birds are now profoundly disliked by many people. Not for any characteristic of the birds themselves, rather in this case they've become the epicentre of a complex and ongoing struggle over land and livelihood. I've introduced the story of the aga here to highlight the fact that the complex and very often competing ethical obligations that arise in the context of extinction include impacts on the lives and livelihoods of local people, including many Indigenous people who are already living with the ongoing impacts of waves of colonisation, militarisation, globalisation and more. This point links us back to my earlier discussion of biocultural unravelling, which highlighted the rippling and often profoundly unequal impacts of species extinction. In other words, that the loss of a species is felt and experienced differently by diverse living beings that are in relationship with them. But here we're reminded that understanding these complex webs of relationship is not just about making sense of how extinction impacts on others. It's also about seeing how we are all differently culpable for any given extinction, and of devising better ways of responding to those potential losses. In the particular case of the aga, conservationists and an endangered species have often, but not always, come into conflict with local people. Sadly, this is a dynamic that's played out again and again around the world, as has been shown by decades of scholarship on fortress conservation and the imposition of external, often culturally and sometimes ecologically inappropriate environmental management regimes. However, there are genuine and ongoing efforts in Rota to build more sustaining relationships between local people, conservationists and crows. And in other cases that I've explored, endangered species have even become powerful allies of Indigenous people in their efforts and their struggles for land and culture. One of the most inspiring examples of this situation in my work, or that I've written about, is the work of the group Malama Makua in Hawaii, who have campaigned on behalf of and with endangered tree snails, utilising the force of the US Federal Endangered Species Act and the court system in their struggles to prevent the US Army from continuing to destroy a sacred valley on the island of Oahu. And I should say that they have incredibly successfully worked with the snail to halt the activities of the army in that valley for well over a decade now. I hope that what's clear from these short accounts of the whooping crane and the Mariana crow is that both extinction and efforts to prevent extinction are very ethically complicated. No two extinction events are identical. And so just as we require detailed empirical engagement in order to make sense of what's being lost in extinction and the multiple meanings and significances of that loss, we also require relentlessly specific approaches to the ethical questions raised by conservation. Our ethics needs to be one of navigating competing interests and claims and ultimately finding a way through. It requires that ethics move out of the armchair into the field to draw on the insights of the natural sciences as well as the lived experiences of local communities whose lives are bound up with disappearing species in a host of different, profoundly unequal ways. Just a final short section and a final story. The southeast corner of the Australian continent was once crisscrossed by the nomadic flight paths of the regent honeyeater. For hundreds of thousands of years, they winged their way up and down this vast continent, moving from forest to forest, feeding on the nectar of flowering eucalypts. Today, everything has changed. Today, the species is just clinging to existence. The decline of the regent honeyeater is a story of the loss of the eucalypt forests that they rely on. But the story is more complex than a simple narrative of habitat loss. In particular, it seems that as the regent honeyeater numbers have declined, their social relationships have also unravelled. The birds no longer exist in the kinds of numbers necessary for them to flock together to defend their nesting sites. But also, fascinatingly and crucially, they no longer exist in the numbers that are necessary for juvenile birds to be reliably exposed to adults from whom they can learn their songs. And so their songs are breaking down, which is contributing to the breakdown of the forming of pairs, reproductive pairs, and the successful reproduction of the species. So the birds, their flocks, their songs and their forests are all deeply tangled up with one another, mutually produced, and so each is profoundly vulnerable to the loss of the others. In a recent multimedia essay that I produced with colleagues in the humanities, design and biology, we sought to tell this story of social and environmental unravelling. Incorporating audio clips from the birds and a range of images woven through text, we explored the affordances of a multimedia environment to draw out the complex spatial and temporal dynamics of regent honeyeater life and to make palpable for the audience the complex way in which this species and its particular way of life has been sustained by forests that are now disappearing. So this is the most recent in a long series of experiments in my work to tell extinction stories differently. Very early on in my career as an academic, I realised that I wanted to address as broad an audience as possible. When told well, stories are a vital technology for allowing ideas to travel far and wide. In contrast to a lot of highly technical academic language, stories have the potential to be memorable, accessible, and engaging to wide audiences. For a researcher like myself, this has meant learning to write in new ways, but it's also required working across a variety of different media, from exhibitions and documentaries to a primary school learning resource, as well as working to create community storytelling archives that provide space for other people to tell their own stories about what extinction means and how it matters to them. But my commitment to storytelling is about more than reaching a wide audience. Or rather, it's about the capacity to reach audiences in particular kinds of ways. As Deborah Bird-Rose and I have explored in our shared work, storytelling offers a means not simply of recounting the kind of ethical complexity that I've been describing in this lecture, but of really grappling with it. It's the capacity of stories to summon up a thicker sense of diverse, overlapping, and sometimes conflicting meanings and consequences that we have found so ethically productive. This kind of storytelling is an effort to draw ever more voices and perspectives into the discussion, to attend to the situated complexity of this extinction, this encounter, and in so doing to craft a response, albeit one that's necessarily partial and open to revision. The point of telling stories like these, of course, is not simply to inform, but to transform. And it's here that much of the ethical charge of storytelling lies. As the philosopher Megan Craig notes, the stories that we tell and those we hear bear profoundly upon the texture of our lives and our openness or closedness to other forms of life. In summoning up other beings and their worlds of relationship, stories draw us into a situated encounter, into new ways of understanding, and with them new responsibilities. My sincere hope is that the stories that I and my colleagues tell can make a difference in the world, that we can open up new and richer ways of understanding what extinction means, why it matters, and why we must respond, and how we can do so in ways that take seriously the flourishing of diverse, multi-species communities. But of course, this isn't always possible. Tragically, the regent honeyeater is a case in point. While conservation efforts continue for the species, the sad reality is that it's likely already too late, especially in the absence of the political will to save and replant the forests that the birds need. And yet my firm conviction is that telling these stories matters anyway. Doing so is an act of bearing witness. There are two key facets to bearing witness, that of being present and observing, and that of sharing the experience with others. Witnessing is taken up as an act of faithfulness to the dead and dying, even if we cannot change the situation for them, in this case, prevent the extinction of their species. Bearing witness to that loss is still a vitally important work. While doing so might help prevent other future extinctions, this is not the only or even the primary point of bearing witness. It is first and foremost an effort to cultivate some semblance of an ethical relationship with those whose deaths we are, each in our own complex ways, complicit in. This is the context in which we tell extinction stories today. Ours is a time of mass extinction, a time of the ongoing destruction and colonisation of diverse human and non-human lives. But it's also a time that holds the promise of many fragile forms of recuperation and hopes for new modes of multi-species flourishing. In this context, storytelling is very multifaceted, I think. It's about the weaving together of diverse voices and perspectives. It's about the cultivation of ever richer capacities to understand and appreciate our living world. It's about the transformation and the transformative potential of being brought into an encounter with others. And of course, it's about bearing witness to the many losses that will not be averted. Put simply, I think storytelling is a vital work for our times. Thank you.